If you ever needed an example of bad and sloppy testing, Trafotin's latest video has you covered.
Of course, I'd be remiss to talk about this topic without talking about the major selling points of Linux, its performance on lower-end hardware. And it's really important to acknowledge that the weaker a computer is, it's going to limit your options to do specific things.
This is true, regardless of whether hardware is new or old. Even with modern hardware, it's unrealistic to expect something like a cheap Chromebook to run Cyberpunk at 4K 60 FPS. You might be able to get away with some older hardware, but depending on the software in question, your mileage will vary considerably.
When I was trying to run games on the HP Compact, I just could not get multiple video games to run. Most games would just spit out OpenGL errors or DirectX errors because they wouldn't work at all. For example, the Grim Fandango Remastered encountered errors because it requires OpenGL 3.3 or higher, and the Core 2 Duo only supports up to OpenGL 2.1. But how do I know it only supports up to OpenGL 2.1? Well, my friends, it's because of this thing called MindTest, which nicely tells you what version of OpenGL that you're running at the top, which runs at an average of 20 FPS, which is probably not acceptable given the pixelated state of MindTest.
Let's quickly recap Trafotin's specs from the video. He says his machine is running an Intel Core 2 Duo processor with 4GB of RAM and doesn't mention a graphics card. Now let's compare those specs to the system requirements for the game itself. Regardless of operating system, the game specifically supports the Intel Core 2 Duo processor, requires 4GB of RAM, and requires certain graphics cards. I'm guessing Trafotin's issue is the lack of a sufficient graphics card and not a limitation of the CPU. Seems like Trafotin was trying to use integrated graphics instead of a dedicated GPU. However, a simple search shows that processors of that era didn't have built-in graphics like our modern processors. In fact, the minimum supported integrated graphics is Intel HD 4000, which are the third-generation Core processors. Seems like such a huge oversight. It makes me wonder if Trafotin bothered to read the game's requirements, or if he was hoping nobody would notice.
But despite being able to meet every minimum requirement, except for the GPU one, Rebel Galaxy still fails to launch at all, even if you launch it in its DirectX 9 mode. And games like Abzu and Cuphead won't launch because of DirectX 11 compatibility issues, because DirectX 11 doesn't support the Intel Core 2 Duo.
Again, you need a graphics card in order to run these games. It's a graphics card issue, not a CPU issue.
You can't do proper developing because compiling your programs is going to take literal hours. And that doesn't mean that the computer is incapable, but there's a serious limitation with what you can or can't do.
Based on what I've seen so far, your lack of effort is your real problem. You didn't even bother to try these games on Windows for comparison. Hell, you couldn't even bother trying to use a graphics card to see if your experience improved. Instead, you took the lazy route, and any issues that popped up, you simply chalked it up to being a Linux problem instead of user error.